Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the universe preparing us for who we're meant to become. In the unforgiving heartland, where the earth demands honesty and men often deliver deceit, a legend whispered through the dust, and diesel fumes was about to bloom. This was a tale of grit, of the silent strength found when all is lost, and of the price of both arrogance and resilience. The slap of water against concrete was a sound Ben knew well, a clean, simple rhythm to his days. But this morning, it was abruptly shattered by the sharp, metallic clang of a galvanized steel bucket hitting the pristine floor of the processing facility's entryway. It rolled once, a clumsy, hollow pirouette, before settling on its side, its contents, a murky mix of gray water and pine-scented disinfectant, spreading like a dark, accusing stain. Ben didn't flinch. His gaze, as steady as the horizon over a fallow field, simply watched the water find its level. Fate has a cruel way of giving us exactly what we need at the moment we least expect it. He needed this quiet life, this anonymity, this escape from the world he'd once commanded. But the universe, it seemed, had other, more visceral plans for Benjamin Carter. The stillness of the early morning, usually a balm, now felt brittle, a fragile shell about to crack. "Clean this up," a voice, sharp and cutting, sliced through the calm. It was the voice of Mr. Sterling, the farm's newly appointed export director, a man whose presence felt like an insult to the honest air. His tone, polished by boardrooms and devoid of genuine authority, grated against the quiet rhythm of the farm. "And next time, keep your trash out of the main entrance." Sterling stood there, a vision of tailored contempt. His charcoal gray suit, a fabric of imported wool, probably cost more than Ben earned in half a year. His Italian leather shoes, immaculately polished, reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead with a sterile glare that seemed to mock the earthy grit of the farm. He looked at Ben not as a person, but as a slow-moving, inconvenient piece of the landscape, something to be managed or preferably removed. The word trash hung in the air, thick and oily, not just describing the spilled bucket, but saturating the very essence of Ben, his worn denim, his scuffed work boots, his calloused hands, his quiet presence. To Sterling, Ben was refuse, an unsightly stain on the carefully curated image of Hayes family farms. The injustice burrowed deep, a familiar ache in Ben's chest, a ghost of a past humiliation. He felt the phantom weight of expectations, the invisible chains of a system that judged men by their labels. Ben didn't answer. Words were a currency he had long since stopped trading in, a weapon he had willingly laid down. He simply bent down, his back straight, his movements economical, a silent testament to years of disciplined labor, and picked up the bucket. He reached for the mop he'd left leaning against the wall, his silence a vast, empty space that Sterling seemed compelled to fill with more noise, more contempt. "We have an important delegation arriving any minute. $50 million on the line," Sterling elaborated, his voice rising with a frantic edge that belied his facade of control. "The future of this entire operation hangs by a thread, and I have to walk in and see this." He gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist at Ben, the mop, the growing puddle. "Honestly, Hayes needs to hire a better class of help, people who understand the gravity of a negotiation, not just how to push a broom." Sterling's words were a whip, intended to sting, but Ben had learned to absorb such blows, to let them pass through him like the wind through an empty field. Yet beneath the surface of his composure, a tremor began. The reference to the farm's future, the mention of $50 million, snagged at a deeper concern, stirring the sleeping giant of his buried professional self. Ben's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the rough wooden handle of the mop. A better class. The words echoed in the cavern of his memory, sharp and unwelcome. He thought about the classes he'd once attended, not of status, but of learning, the hushed, ivy-covered halls of Georgetown, the challenging lectures that had shaped his intellect. He remembered the feel of different kinds of paper, the crisp, vital weight of a diplomatic brief versus the flimsy tear sheet of a hastily drafted trade agreement. He recalled the hushed, vital silence of an embassy meeting room in Beijing, a silence pregnant with meaning, with the fate of nations, so profoundly different from the empty, scornful silence he now inhabited, a self-imposed exile. He dipped the mop into the spreading puddle, the coarse fibers greedily soaking up the mess. He was good at cleaning up messes. It was, in a way, what he had always done. He just used to do it with words, with nuance, with the delicate dance of international diplomacy, instead of water and pine disinfectant. The universe, in its relentless wisdom, often forces us to confront the very skills we thought we'd abandoned. A low hum grew in the distance, evolving into the distinct, powerful thrum of expensive engines. A fleet of sleek black town cars was pulling up the long gravel driveway, their tires crunching over the stones with an ominous sound of finality. The Chinese delegation had arrived. Mr. Sterling, momentarily distracted from his tirade, straightened his silk tie, his movements a nervous tic that betrayed the hairline crack in his arrogant facade. He shot one last venomous look at Ben, a silent order more potent than words. "Make sure you're gone before they get in here. I don't want them thinking this is a soup kitchen." His voice was low, laced with a desperate urgency, a fear that Ben, in his worn overalls, might somehow contaminate the crucial optics of the moment. Sterling then strode toward the double-glass doors, a practiced, superficial smile already forming on his face, a mask of professionalism he hoped would fool the arriving dignitaries. Ben continued his work, the rhythmic swish of the mop a quiet counterpoint to the hurried, almost frantic beat of his own heart. He was just a farmhand, silent Ben, the man who kept his head down and his mouth shut, whose past was as buried as the ancient roots beneath the fertile soil. Yet, as the first members of the Chinese delegation stepped out of their cars, their faces grim, their postures rigid, Ben felt a familiar, long-dormant instinct stir within him. It was the instinct of a man who could read not just the room, but the subtle, unspoken language of a deal on the verge of collapse. And this one, he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, was already dying. The fate of Hayes family farms, a legacy built over a century of sweat and soil, was being gambled on the hubris of a man who saw only surfaces. The conference room at Hayes family farms, a jarring counterpoint to the rustic charm of the fields outside, was a study in forced modernity. A gleaming mahogany table, far too large for the modest room, was surrounded by leather chairs that sighed with an expensive reluctance whenever someone shifted their weight. On one wall, a massive flat-screen monitor displayed the farm's logo, a wholesome, sun-drenched landscape that felt a million miles away from the frigid tension currently gripping the room. Mr. Hayes, the farm's owner, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry lines etched by decades of wrestling with the land and the markets, sat at the head of the table. He looked deeply uncomfortable, a man of the earth trapped in a sterile, air-conditioned battle that was decidedly not his territory. His hands, usually busy with the practicalities of farming, fidgeted nervously beneath the table, the weight of generations, of a legacy teetering on the brink of financial ruin, pressed down on him. The $50 million deal wasn't just a number. It was the lifeblood of his family's century-old farm, a bulwark against the crushing weight of looming debt. That territory belonged, ostensibly, to Mr. Sterling. The export director stood near the monitor, his confident posture from the morning having entirely evaporated, replaced by a sheen of clammy sweat on his brow. Opposite him sat the Chinese delegation, 5 men in dark, conservative suits, their expressions unyielding. Their leader, a stern, hawk-nosed man in his late 50s named Mr. Li, had a document spread out before him. His finger was jabbing emphatically at a specific paragraph. His voice, a low, guttural torrent of Mandarin that needed no translation to be understood as furious, a storm brewing in the polished confines of the room. The air was thick with unspoken threats, with the impending implosion of a critical agreement. The official translator, a young woman from a contracted agency, was nowhere to be seen. A frantic phone call a half-hour earlier had revealed her car was trapped in a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate. There was no backup. They were alone, adrift in a sea of cultural and linguistic misunderstanding. The irony of Sterling's earlier dismissiveness was not lost on Ben, who, from his vantage point, saw the unfolding disaster with the cold precision of a surgeon. "Please, Mr. Li," Sterling began, his voice a full octave higher than usual, cracking under the immense pressure. "If you could just explain the issue slowly, perhaps we can." His words trailed off, a desperate plea hanging in the air, already doomed. Mr. Li cut him off with a sharp, slicing gesture of his hand, his eyes burning with a controlled fury. He barked another string of sentences at one of his aides, a younger man with an impassive face, who then stood and addressed Sterling in heavily accented but disturbingly precise English. "Mr. Li is deeply displeased. He says your contract is not a negotiation. It is an insult, a fundamental disrespect to his nation and his people." Sterling's face went from pale to a blotchy red, a tide of panic rising. "An insult. It's a standard export agreement. We've used it 100 times. This is a simple misunderstanding, a boilerplate clause." His words were hollow, ringing with a desperate ignorance. The aide conferred with Mr. Li, whose face only darkened, his hawkish gaze sharpening. "The insult is in your assumption of our ignorance. Specifically," the aide's finger now joined his boss's on the paper, tapping emphatically, Clause 4.2, regarding import tariffs and agricultural subsidies. "It implies a status that is, frankly, archaic and offensive." Panic, cold and absolute, seized Sterling. He didn't know the first thing about Clause 4.2. It was boilerplate, legal jargon his team had copied and pasted from an old template, a relic from a different era of international trade. He had read it, of course, superficially, but he hadn't understood it. He saw the words, not the dangerous, complex meaning behind them. He had assumed, with the casual arrogance of a man who had never truly been challenged, that the other side was just as superficial, just as careless. This was a catastrophic miscalculation, a failure of due diligence that now threatened to unravel everything. The $50 million deal, his ticket to a corner office, a bigger bonus and a secured future, was bleeding out on the gleaming mahogany table, its life force draining with every word. The future of Hayes Family Farms, a legacy built on honest soil, was about to be sacrificed on the altar of Sterling's ineptitude. Mr. Hayes shifted in his chair, a man witnessing the slow, agonizing death of his life's work. Desperate, Sterling pulled out his top-of-the-line smartphone, a gleaming symbol of his reliance on technology over true understanding. "One moment. I have an application," he mumbled, clutching at the digital straw. He fumbled with the screen, his thumb slipping on the glass, betraying his mounting anxiety. He found the translation app, a marvel of modern technology he'd boasted about just last week, touting its AI prowess. He held it out, trying to capture Mr. Li's angry speech, a digital net thrown into a torrent of nuanced frustration. The phone listened, processed, and then spoke in a tinny, robotic voice, its artificial intelligence utterly failing to grasp the cultural context, the diplomatic tightrope walk. The honorable chicken flies west for the winter banquet. A stunned, deadly silence fell over the room, heavier than any spoken word. The Chinese delegation stared, their anger momentarily replaced by sheer, unadulterated disbelief. One of the younger aides choked back a laugh, quickly disguising it as a cough, but the damage was done. Mr. Li's face, which had been a thundercloud of fury, now became a mask of stone, colder and more impenetrable than before. The insult had just compounded itself with an absurdity so profound, it was almost comical, stripping Sterling of any remaining credibility. The last shred of respect, if any had remained, was now obliterated. Sterling stared at his phone as if it had personally betrayed him, its silicon heart mocking his desperation. The app was useless. It couldn't grasp context, nuance, or the subtle, treacherous currents of legal terminology. It was a toy, and he had just tried to use it to defuse a ticking bomb of international diplomacy. He felt a wave of dizziness, the room closing in around him, the air thick with his own failure. The deal was dead. His career, the polished facade he had so carefully constructed, was dead, buried under a mountain of hubris and incompetence. He felt the precipice of his financial and social ruin yawning before him, a stark reflection of Ben's own fall, but devoid of any quiet dignity. Outside the conference room, Ben was sweeping the hallway, his broom a rhythmic counterpoint to the silent chaos unfolding within. He worked slowly, meticulously, his broom collecting dust and stray bits of dried grass. He hadn't been told to stay close, but he had. That old instinct, the one that had served him so well in tense consular meetings and delicate back-channel negotiations across the globe, told him the pressure inside that room was building to a critical point. He could almost feel the vibrations of failure through the soles of his boots, a visceral tremor in the very foundation of the farm. The shouting had subsided, replaced by a silence that was far more dangerous, the quiet hum of impending doom. He heard the tinny, robotic voice from Sterling's phone and knew, with a sinking certainty, that the situation had just plummeted from critical to catastrophic. He pushed the pile of dust into a pan, his movements deliberate, just as the conference room door flew open with a violent crack. Mr. Sterling stumbled out, his face the color of ash, his carefully constructed composure shattered. He was holding the contract, the offending document, as if it were a venomous snake, its pages laced with the poison of his own making. He paced the length of the hallway, a caged animal, muttering to himself, running a trembling hand through his already disheveled hair. He looked trapped, cornered, his eyes darting wildly. And like any cornered animal, he was looking for something, anything to lash out at. His wild, desperate eyes landed on Ben, the quiet farmhand. Ben, leaning on his broom, happened to glance down at the paper in Sterling's trembling hand. He couldn't help it. The pull was too strong. The neat columns of text, the familiar blend of English and intricate Mandarin characters in the bilingual formatting, were like an old, forgotten song, a language his mind had once spoken as fluently as his native tongue. His eyes, trained by years of deciphering complex international agreements, saw the clause number instantly, 4.2. And in the dense block of Mandarin, he saw the specific characters Mr. Li had likely been pointing at with such fury. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Guanshui Bile asterisk. Tariff barrier. And next to it, the phrase Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Fei Shicheng Jingji Diwei. Non-market economy status. It wasn't just an insult. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of Chinese trade policy, a rookie mistake of such magnitude it bordered on diplomatic sabotage. It was a political minefield, carelessly embedded in a business deal, utterly betraying a profound ignorance of the global stage. The sheer amateurism of it made Ben's stomach clench. Sterling saw the direction of Ben's gaze. He saw the farmhand, the floor sweeper, the man he had called trash, looking at the document that was about to ruin his life, his career, his carefully cultivated existence. A bitter, hysterical laugh escaped his lips, sharp and desperate. The sheer absurdity of it. This simpleton in muddy boots, this manual laborer, looking at a complex $50 million international contract, was the final straw for his frayed nerves. His arrogance, usually a shield, now became a weapon of self-destruction. "What?" Sterling sneered, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm, his eyes crazed. He strode over to Ben, shoving the paper into his face, the scent of fear and expensive cologne wafting off him in waves. "You think you can read this? You, the janitor. You think you understand the complexities of international trade, you who can barely understand a tractor manual." His words were laced with a cruel delight, a desperate attempt to regain some shred of superiority. Ben remained silent, his eyes scanning the paragraph, absorbing its full, devastating implications. It was worse than he thought. The phrasing implied that China would be responsible for absorbing tariff fluctuations imposed by a third-party nation, a condition no sovereign economic power, especially one as proud as China, would ever accept. It was not just unprofessional, it was an act of diplomatic aggression, however accidental. It was amateur hour on a global stage, orchestrated by a man who had no business being there. Sterling laughed again, louder this time, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the quiet hall, bouncing off the sterile white walls. The pressure had finally broken him, tipping him into a state of reckless, self-destructive arrogance. He was spiraling, dragging anyone near him into his vortex of despair. "Tell you what, farm boy," he said, his voice ringing with manic bravado, a twisted challenge born of desperation. "I'll make you a bet. You're so smart, you can read my $50 million contract." He jabbed a finger at the dense block of Mandarin characters, his hand trembling. "I'll give you my entire month's salary if you can translate even one single word of that for me. Just one, go on." He leaned in closer, his eyes crazed, a desperate challenge emanating from his rapidly unraveling sanity. "Go on, impress me. What does it say? Does it say you're fired? Does it say Hayes Family Farms is bankrupt? Tell me, expert asterisk." The hallway was quiet save for the low hum of the ventilation system. Ben looked up from the paper, his gaze meeting Sterling's for the first time that day. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, no hint of the humiliation that should have been his. There was only a profound, ancient calm, the quiet certainty of a man who had seen empires rise and fall over conference tables and knew, with absolute certainty, that the game was now his to control. He held Sterling's gaze for a long moment, an eternity in the confined space, letting the weight of his unyielding presence settle. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned his broom against the wall. The soft clatter of the wooden handle against the drywall sounded like a gavel falling, a definitive pronouncement in the silent chamber of fate. The world seemed to slow down. For Ben, the hallway, with its sterile white walls and the palpable scent of Sterling's desperation, faded away. In its place, he felt the familiar ghost of a different life stir within him, a life he had painstakingly buried. He felt the weight of a tailored suit on his shoulders, the smooth, cool leather of a diplomatic pouch in his hand, the charged, vital silence of a negotiation room in the heart of Beijing. The man who had sought refuge in anonymity, who had buried his past under calloused hands and a vow of silence, was gone. In his place stood Benjamin Carter, former senior trade attaché to the U.S. Embassy in China, a man who had once arbitrated deals 10 times this size before breakfast, a quiet titan of international diplomacy. The humiliation of the morning, the pain point that had festered, now ignited a radical decision, a dormant fire rekindled. The choice to act to reclaim his voice was made in that silent, deliberate moment. He took the contract from Sterling's unresisting hand, the paper feeling familiar, almost an extension of his own will, a weapon he hadn't wielded in years but had never forgotten how to use. He walked past the stunned executive, whose mouth hung agape, a portrait of disbelief, and stepped through the open door into the conference room, into the heart of the crisis. The atmosphere inside was glacial, a tomb of shattered expectations. Mr. Hayes looked utterly defeated, his face etched with the bitter lines of a man watching his legacy crumble. The Chinese delegation was beginning to pack their briefcases with a solemn efficiency, the universal sign of a negotiation's death, the final rites being performed over a deal that lay stillborn. Mr. Lee, their leader, didn't even look up as Ben entered, dismissing him as just another part of the scenery, another disappointing feature of this failed enterprise. He was simply an interloper, a peasant worker in a room of elites. Ben walked to the head of the table, opposite Mr. Lee, his movements deliberate, imbued with a quiet authority that belied his appearance. He placed the contract down, smoothing it with one hand, a gesture of respect for the document, for the process. Then he looked directly at Mr. Lee, bowed his head slightly in a gesture of formal respect, a gesture born of deep cultural understanding, and began to speak. The voice that came out of him was not the quiet, hesitant murmur anyone on the farm might have expected. It was clear, resonant, and confident, cutting through the heavy silence with the precision of a finely honed blade. And it was not English. Chinese letter, 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 he began, his tone unwavering. Mr. Lee, please forgive this interruption and misunderstanding. The language that flowed from him was not the textbook Mandarin of a student, nor the clumsy, fractured phrasing of a translation app. It was flawless, native-level Beijing Mandarin, complete with the subtle retroflex consonants and the correct, honorific cadence used in high-level business and diplomacy. It was the language of the Forbidden City, of complex negotiations in hushed government halls, not the rough lexicon of a phrasebook. It was the voice of an insider, a master of the system Sterling had so ineptly navigated. Every head in the room snapped toward him, as if pulled by an invisible string. The Chinese aides stopped packing, their hands froze in mid-motion, their expressions shifting from polite disinterest to stunned bewilderment. Mr. Hayes's jaw dropped, his eyes wide with utter shock, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. Sterling, who had followed Ben into the room like a man in a trance, a mere shadow of his former arrogance, simply stared, his face a mask of disbelief, his world inverted in an instant. The floor sweeper, the trash, was speaking the language of emperors. Mr. Lee looked up, his stony expression cracking for the first time, a fissure appearing in his carefully maintained facade. A flicker of genuine surprise, then intrigued curiosity, crossed his features. He leaned forward, studying Ben not as a farmhand, but as an equal, a sudden, formidable presence. Ben continued, his tone calm and respectful, yet imbued with an unshakable firmness. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 4.2, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. My name is Benjamin. I have read clause 4.2 of the contract. It is indeed a grave error, and it does not represent our company's sincere intentions. It is a relic, a misunderstanding, not an intentional slight. He didn't just speak. He communicated, bridging the vast chasm of cultural and linguistic divide that Sterling had created. He used phrases that acknowledged their justified anger without being subservient, validating their position, a crucial first step in any de-escalation. His words were a carefully constructed bridge, inviting understanding, not demanding submission. Mr. Lee responded, his own Mandarin sharp and testing, a probe into Ben's depth of knowledge. He asked a complex question about the legal precedent for tariff indemnity in the agricultural sector, a clear challenge to see if this farmhand's fluency was more than a party trick, a mere performance. He wanted to know if the man before him truly understood the intricate tapestry of international trade law. Without hesitation, Ben answered, not just translating but contextualizing, providing the historical and political backdrop to the clause. He explained that the problematic clause was a relic from an outdated template, likely designed for trade with a non-WTO member nation, and its inclusion was a result of clerical oversight, not malicious intent. He used the precise legal and economic terminology, weaving a complex answer with the effortless grace of a master, demonstrating a granular understanding of trade agreements, international organizations, and the delicate balance of global commerce. He spoke of the nuances of most favored nation status and specific bilateral trade agreements, painting a comprehensive picture of the error's roots. The entire delegation was now listening with rapt attention, their initial suspicion replaced by a palpable sense of respect. This was a language they understood, not just the words but the deep, structural knowledge of international trade law, the political and economic undercurrents that shaped global commerce. This was not a farmhand. This was an expert, a fellow traveler in the rarefied world of high-stakes negotiation. Mr. Lee's aides, their faces once carefully impassive, now exchanged glances of astonished recognition. The gravity of the situation, the precipice of ruin, slowly began to recede. After a solid minute of intense, rapid-fire exchange, Mr. Lee fell silent, his eyes narrowed in a look of profound reappraisal. The surprise had given way to something deeper, recognition. Then he did something that made everyone else in the room hold their breath, a gesture of respect rarely afforded to strangers, let alone an unexpected interloper. He stood up, walked around the table to where Ben was standing, and gave a short, formal bow, his head inclining deeply. His aides, seeing this unequivocal sign of respect from their leader, immediately stood and did the same, a ripple of deference moving through the room. It was a sign of ultimate respect. In their world, knowledge was power, expertise the highest virtue, and honor a currency far more valuable than gold. In that moment, Ben was not silent Ben the farmhand, the man of manual labor. He was Benjamin Carter, a man worthy of their esteem, a bridge between cultures, a force to be reckoned with. The immediate crisis had been averted, but the true magnitude of Ben's reemergence was only just beginning to unfold. The first mini-boss of the emotional progression, the failing negotiation, had been conquered, but the battle for his identity and the farm's future was far from over. Ben returned the bow with practiced grace, a seamless integration of his past and present self. Then, He turned his attention away from the delegation, whose expressions now held a cautious optimism, and looked directly at the man who was still standing, frozen, by the door. Sterling remained a figure of absolute disbelief, a statue carved from his own shattered arrogance. Ben's voice, when he spoke now in perfect, unaccented English, was quiet, but it carried the undeniable weight of thunder, resonating with a power that filled the room. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his gaze unwavering, piercing through the export director's fragile composure. The blood had drained from Sterling's face, leaving it pasty and ghost-like. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, a specter of his own failure, a ghost who spoke fluent Mandarin and had just single-handedly resurrected a $50 million deal he had personally murdered through his negligence and contempt. He could only stare, mute and uncomprehending, his mind struggling to reconcile the floor sweeper, the trash, with the master negotiator who now commanded the attention and respect of the powerful delegation. The floor sweeper, the trash, was now the absolute center of power in the room, holding the rapt attention of the very men Sterling had failed so spectacularly to impress, and indeed had actively insulted. The reversal was complete, utterly humiliating. Ben held the contract in his hand, his thumb resting near the problematic clause, a silent accusation. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to shout. The silence in the room amplified his words, giving them the undeniable force of a judge's sentence, a final decree. "They are not just angry," Ben began, his eyes locked on Sterling's, holding him captive. "They are insulted. Profoundly. Your contract, specifically Clause 4.2, doesn't just ask for unfair terms. It is structured under the assumption that the People's Republic of China operates as a non-market economy. This is a politically charged designation, one that hasn't been relevant to this kind of trade negotiation in over a decade, a ghost of Cold War-era diplomacy. It's the legal equivalent of calling their entire economic system illegitimate, a direct challenge to their sovereignty and their global standing." He tapped the paper with the tip of his finger, the sound of faint but sharp punctuation mark. "You didn't just make a financial error, Mr. Sterling. You made a political one. You brought a loaded weapon to a dinner party. They believe you either did this intentionally to insult them, or, and I quote Mr. Lee directly from our earlier conversation, you are an incompetent child playing with his father's checkbook, a fool whose ambition far outstrips his understanding." Sterling flinched as if he'd been physically struck, the raw truth of Ben's words a brutal blow. The color was returning to his face in blotchy, panicked patches, a grotesque blush of shame and terror. He opened his mouth, his jaw working, but no sound came out. What could he say? Ben had just translated not only the words, but the crushing subtext, the cultural and political nuance that his expensive translation app could never hope to grasp. He had laid Sterling's incompetence bare for everyone to see, exposed him as a fraud in the very arena he claimed to master. The humiliation was absolute, a bitter, bitter draft. Mr. Hayes, the farm owner who had been watching this unfold with a mixture of awe, horror, and dawning understanding, finally spoke, his voice rough, like stones grinding together. "Ben, how is this possible?" His question hung in the air, echoing the unspoken thoughts of everyone in the room. He saw his own prior misjudgment, his trust placed in the wrong hands, his farm's future almost squandered. Ben held up a hand, a gesture that was not disrespectful but commanded patience, a silent plea for focus. The immediate crisis was not yet fully averted. The negotiations still needed to be solidified. His past could wait. The farm's future, however, could not. He turned his attention back to the Chinese delegation, a swift pivot of focus, a testament to his ingrained professionalism. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, he said, switching back to Mandarin with fluid ease, his voice now a soothing balm after the storm of accusation. He walked over to the large whiteboard that had been set up for Sterling's failed presentation, a blank canvas awaiting a master's touch. He picked up a dry erase marker, its felt tip a simple tool in the hands of an expert. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, 4.2, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Mr. Lee, if you'll permit me, I believe we can solve this right now. If we were to remove clause 4.2 entirely and replace it with a more balanced and forward-looking mechanism. For the next 45 minutes, the conference room transformed from a morgue into a masterclass, a vibrant theater of global commerce. Ben was no longer just a translator. He was a conductor, orchestrating a complex symphony of law, finance, and culture. He didn't just propose deleting the offensive clause. That would have been too simple, a mere patch on a gaping wound, leaving the underlying tension unaddressed. Instead, he acknowledged that the core issue, managing the risk of unforeseen tariffs and market volatility, was a valid and legitimate concern for both sides. The original clause was simply a clumsy, insulting, and ultimately dangerous way of addressing it. He sketched out a new proposal on the whiteboard, his handwriting in both English and Mandarin neat and precise, betraying the disciplined mind at work. He proposed a floating tariff codicil, a dynamic addendum to the contract. He drew charts and diagrams, explaining with clarity and conciseness how it would work. Instead of placing the entire burden on one party, the clause would establish a shared risk corridor. If new agricultural tariffs were imposed by either the US or China, any increase up to 3% would be absorbed by Hayes family farms. Any increase between 3% and 7% would be split evenly between the two parties, a testament to mutual responsibility. And any catastrophic tariff event over 7% would trigger a renegotiation clause, allowing both parties to exit the contract without penalty, providing a safety net for unforeseen global disruptions. It was brilliant. It was elegant. It was fair. It protected Hayes family farms from minor market fluctuations while shielding the Chinese buyers from major political fallout, transforming a point of contention into a symbol of partnership and mutual trust. Ben, with the precision of a seasoned diplomat, knew that a lasting deal was one that served the interests of all parties, not just one. He spoke directly to Mr. Lee's chief financial officer, referencing specific articles of the international commercial terms, Incoterms, demonstrating a granular understanding of logistics, shipping liability, and global supply chains. He discussed currency fluctuation risks with another aide, suggesting a hedging strategy using a basket of currencies to mitigate exposure for both sides, showcasing an astute grasp of financial instruments. He was not just saving the deal, he was improving it, making it stronger, more resilient, and ultimately more profitable and equitable for everyone involved. He was forging a partnership where Sterling had created antagonism. Sterling stood by the wall, shrinking with every word Ben spoke, every elegant solution presented. He was a spectator at his own execution, his professional life dissecting before his eyes. The world he understood, a rigid hierarchy based on job titles, suit prices, and superficial power, had been inverted, shattered into a million pieces. The man he considered less than human, the trash he had ordered to clean his mess, was now displaying a level of intelligence, expertise, and nuanced understanding he couldn't even begin to fathom. He was watching a grandmaster play chess while he, Sterling, had been struggling with the basic rules of checkers, utterly outclassed, utterly humiliated. Mr. Hayes watched, his expression unreadable, a complex mixture of astonishment, relief, and a dawning, profound understanding. He looked at Ben, then at Sterling, then back at Ben, and a slow, hard truth settled in his eyes. He had been paying the wrong man. He had valued the polished surface over the solid, invaluable core. The integrity of his family's farm, its very survival, had been entrusted to a hollow suit. Finally, Ben put the cap back on the marker, the soft click echoing in the now reverent room. He turned to the delegation, his work complete, his quiet authority undeniable. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Is this a more equitable solution? Does this framework address your concerns while fostering a genuine partnership? He asked, his voice calm, inviting agreement. Mr. Lee, who had been listening intently, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, conferred briefly with his team. There were nods all around, a collective sigh of approval. He stood up, his entire demeanor changed. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep and genuine respect, a rare and precious commodity in the cutthroat world of international trade. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, he said, addressing Ben formally, using the honorific with profound sincerity. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Mr. Benjamin, this is not just equitable. It is a masterpiece of negotiation, a true act of diplomatic genius. He extended his hand, a gesture of profound respect and partnership. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, 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 Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. We accept. Please draft this into the contract, and we will sign it now. We look forward to a long and prosperous collaboration with Hayes Family Farms. Ben took a spare copy of the contract, crossed out the old clause 4.2 with a single, decisive stroke of a pen, a symbolic act of purging the poison, and handwrote the new codicil on the back of the page, his script perfect, precise, and elegant. He wrote it in both English and Mandarin, ensuring there was no ambiguity, no room for future misinterpretation. He initialed the change with a flourish, then slid the paper across the table to Mr. Lee. Without a moment's hesitation, Mr. Lee took a beautiful fountain pen from his breast pocket, a pen that probably cost more than Sterling's Italian shoes, and signed his name with a flourish. He passed it to his aides, who countersigned as witnesses. The $50 million deal was not just saved. It was solidified, strengthened, reborn from the ashes of impending failure, built now on a foundation of mutual respect and brilliant negotiation. The legacy of Hayes Family Farms, its 100-year history, was secure. The crisis had been averted, the mini-boss defeated. The ink was barely dry on the newly signed contract. The tension in the room had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, buzzing energy of relief and accomplishment. The Chinese delegation was smiling, chatting softly among themselves as they gathered their papers, their departure now a friendly farewell rather than a furious storm out. Mr. Hayes was already on the phone with his logistics manager, his voice filled with a lightness that hadn't been there an hour ago, a palpable sense of renewed hope and financial security. The future of his farm, which had been hanging by a thread, was now secure, thriving. Only two people in the room were still locked in the old drama, observers to their own intertwined fates. Ben stood by the table, calm and composed, a quiet architect of salvation. He watched as Sterling, who had been propped up against the wall like a discarded mannequin, finally seemed to regain some semblance of motor function. The executive's face was a mottled canvas of shame, fury, and utter bewilderment. He looked at Ben as if trying to solve an impossible equation, a paradox that defied his understanding. The farmhand, the janitor, the master negotiator. The concepts refused to coexist in his brain, shattering his entire worldview. As the delegation began to file out of the room, shaking Ben's hand warmly, effusively, as they passed, Sterling saw his chance to slip away, to escape the scene of his own implosion, to melt into the shadows before the final reckoning. He started to edge toward the door, hoping to disappear before the full weight of his humiliation could crush him completely. Ben's voice stopped him cold. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the murmurs in the room like a shard of glass, sharp and undeniable. "Mr. Sterling." Sterling froze, his hand on the doorknob, his body rigid with fear and dread. He turned slowly, a hunted, desperate look in his eyes, as if expecting a fatal blow. Ben didn't move from his spot. He simply looked at Sterling, his expression unreadable, devoid of triumph or malice, merely a quiet assertion of power. For a full 10 seconds he said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting Sterling stew in the acidic juices of his own humiliation. The power dynamic had been so completely and irrevocably reversed that it was almost poetic, a perfect symmetrical inversion. The man who had commanded Ben to clean up his trash, who had treated him as refuse, was now being held in place by a mere glance, a silent command more potent than any shout. Finally, Ben spoke again, his voice even, devoid of any emotional charge. It was the voice of a man stating a simple, undeniable fact, a quiet, irrefutable claim. "Before you go," he said, his gaze still fixed on Sterling, "I believe you owe me something." Sterling stared at him blankly, his mind racing, trying to grasp the meaning. "Owe you? What are you talking about? I owe you nothing. You work for Mr. Hayes." A faint, fleeting smile touched Ben's lips, so subtle it might have been imagined. It wasn't a smile of amusement, but of finality, of an ancient justice being served. "Our bet," he clarified, his voice still low, almost conversational. "In the hallway, you said you'd give me your entire month's salary if I could translate one word." He paused, letting the memory surface, stark and undeniable in Sterling's panicked mind. "Well, I believe I translated a bit more than one word. I believe I just saved your job, and your commission, and perhaps the future of this farm, which, by extension, would have impacted any future compensation you might have received." The color drained from Sterling's face once more, leaving it ashen. He remembered. Of course he remembered. He had screamed it in the hallway, a desperate, arrogant taunt, a promise made in the heat of a breakdown, but a promise nonetheless. A foolish wager made by a desperate man. That's ridiculous," Sterling stammered, looking around for support, for an ally, for any sign of mercy. But there was none. Mr. Hayes had hung up his phone and was watching the exchange with cold, calculating eyes, his face a mask of granite resolve. "I don't find it ridiculous," Ben said calmly, his voice never wavering. "I did my part. The terms were quite clear, your salary for 1 month. He tilted his head slightly, a subtle gesture of quiet insistence. "If I recall correctly, a director-level position at a company of this size, with bonuses and incentives, that should be somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000. Give or take. A fair sum for services rendered. $15,000. The number hung in the air, a perfect, crystalline symbol of Sterling's downfall, a monetary measure of his utter humiliation. It was more than Ben made in half a year of hard, physical labor on the farm. It was a fortune to one man, a lifeline. To the other, it was a public shaming, a price exacted for his hubris. "You can't be serious," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking, a desperate plea for reprieve. "I am perfectly serious," Ben replied, his gaze unwavering. "You made a bet in front of a witness. A man's word, especially an executive's, should mean something, shouldn't it? Or is that another outdated concept you've discarded, like the contract you tried to use, like the respect you owe your employees?" He glanced briefly toward the open doorway where one of the junior farmhands had been standing, wide-eyed during the entire hallway confrontation, a silent witness to Sterling's ignominy. The final barb hit its mark, piercing Sterling's last vestiges of pride. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about honor. It was about integrity. It was about the symmetrical, beautiful justice of it all. Sterling, the man who lived by a code of superficial status and empty promises, was being called to account, not by a boardroom, but by the quiet dignity of the man he had scorned. He had kicked over Ben's bucket, a symbolic act of disrespect, of waste. Now Ben was demanding payment, a symbolic act of ultimate respect, the kind that can be measured in dollars and cents, in the undeniable value of competence. Sterling stood there, trapped. To refuse would be to admit he was a man of no integrity, a charlatan in front of his boss and the lingering members of the staff, his reputation utterly destroyed. To agree was to suffer the most profound humiliation of his professional life, to hand over a month's worth of his inflated salary to the man he had called trash, to acknowledge his inferior worth. He looked at Mr. Hayes, a desperate, silent plea in his eyes, begging for intervention. But the old farmer's face was granite, unyielding. There was no help to be found there. There was only judgment, cold and unwavering. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, until Sterling, defeated, finally gave a defeated nod. The game was over. After the delegation had departed in their quiet black cars, their voices now filled with respect and goodwill, and the adrenaline of the negotiation had finally faded. A heavy silence settled over the farm offices. Sterling had scurried away, muttering something about his checkbook, his entire form radiating a defeat so total it was almost pitiable, a cautionary tale of arrogance. Ben was left in the conference room with Mr. Hayes. The old farmer who had watched the entire saga unfold now looked at Ben with a completely new set of eyes. He saw past the worn clothes, the quiet demeanor, the self-imposed anonymity, and for the first time he saw the man underneath, the true measure of Benjamin Carter. "Ben," Mr. Hayes began, his voice raspy with emotion, still tinged with residual shock. I don't even know what to say, or what to ask first. You just saved my farm, my family's legacy. My great-grandfather bought this land over 100 years ago, and I almost lost it because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me." He gestured to one of the leather chairs, a silent invitation to an equal. "Please, sit, you deserve more than my apologies." Ben sat. For the first time all day, he felt the exhaustion settle into his bones. It wasn't the familiar physical tiredness, the pleasant ache from a day of mending fences or baling hay, work that spoke to him of tangible accomplishment. It was a deeper fatigue, the psychic drain of stepping back into a world he had fought so hard to leave behind, a world of intricate lies and manufactured truths. The sudden re-engagement of his dormant intellect had taken its toll. "You can ask whatever you like, Mr. Hayes," Ben said quietly, his gaze steady. "You hired me on faith, gave me a place when I had nowhere else to go. You deserve an explanation, a full accounting." Mr. Hayes poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on the sideboard. his hands, calloused from a lifetime of labor, trembling slightly. He sat down opposite Ben, his gaze searching, respectful. "Sterling called you trash," he said, his voice low and guttural with suppressed anger. "He's been treating all the hands like that for months, like they're lesser. I should have seen it. I should have intervened. I'm truly sorry, Ben, for allowing that to happen on my land." "It's not your fault, Mr. Hayes," Ben replied, a faint, melancholic smile touching his lips. "Men like Sterling see what they want to see, what fits their narrow worldview. A suit is a suit, and overalls are overalls. Labels are the only language they understand, the only way they categorize worth. They can't see beyond the surface to the core of a person." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window, to the honest, open fields. "It's a lesson I learned the hard way myself." "But you," Hayes leaned forward, his eyes searching Ben's face, tracing the lines of hidden wisdom there. "You speak another language. Several, it seems. And not just words, but the language of global power, of intricate finance, of diplomacy. Who are you, son, really?" And so the story came out. Not in a flood, but in a steady, quiet stream, like a river finding its old, forgotten course after a long drought. Ben told him about his life before the farm, a life that now felt like it belonged to another person, a distant, almost mythological figure. He spoke of his degree in international relations from Georgetown, his master's in economic policy from the London School of Economics, of years spent mastering the delicate dance of global power. He talked about joining the State Department, his rapid, almost meteoric rise through the ranks, his fluency not just in Mandarin, but in Russian and German as well, languages he had used to bridge divides and avert crises. He described his posting in Beijing as the senior trade attaché to the U.S. Embassy, a position of immense responsibility and constant pressure. "My job was precisely what I just did in there," Ben explained, gesturing around the now empty, silent conference room. "I was the man in the middle, the conduit, the arbiter. I negotiated treaties. I arbitrated disputes over everything from intellectual property rights for software companies to soybean tariffs for entire nations. I lived on airplanes, in five-star hotels, and in sterile conference rooms, my entire life a relentless negotiation. I was always working, always on call, always balancing the interests of disparate powers." "You were good at it," Hayes stated, the words an affirmation, not a question. A man of the earth, he recognized true craftsmanship when he saw it. "I was," Ben admitted without pride, a ghost of a shadow passing over his face. "I was, by many accounts, one of the best. I understood the numbers, the economic models, the legal precedents, but more importantly, I understood the people, the culture, the unspoken motivations. I knew that a truly lasting deal wasn't about winning. It was about building something that both sides wanted to protect, a foundation of mutual benefit and respect. That's what Sterling never understood. He only saw a transaction, a conquest, not a relationship." "So why?" Hayes asked again, the question hanging heavy in the air, weighted with genuine curiosity and empathy. "Why leave all that behind? The prestige, the power, the global stage. Why come here? To shovel manure, to fix tractors, to disappear into the anonymity of this farm?" Ben's gaze drifted to the window, to the rolling green fields stretching out toward the horizon, bathed in the soft, melancholic glow of the setting sun, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. A profound sadness touched his features, a shadow of a pain that had never truly left, a wound that still pulsed beneath the surface of his quiet life. "Burnout was part of it," he said, his voice becoming softer, almost a whisper. 24/7 pressure, the constant political games, the endless, intricate dances of power. It grinds you down. You start to forget why you're doing it. The numbers get bigger, the stakes become astronomical, but the meaning, the human connection, gets smaller. You become a cog in a vast, impersonal machine. He took a slow, deliberate breath, gathering his thoughts, his memories. But the real reason, the true catalyst, was my wife, Sarah. He spoke of her for the first time in years to another person, releasing a grief that had been locked away in the deepest chambers of his heart. She had been a doctor, brilliant and compassionate, working with an international aid group, dedicating her life to healing and direct human connection. They had met in Shanghai, a chance encounter that had blossomed into a profound love, a counterpoint to his own high-stakes, abstract world. Her work was about saving lives, immediate and tangible, measurable in the smiles of rescued children. His was about saving percentage points on a balance sheet, abstract and often morally ambiguous. She had grounded him, reminded him of what was real, what truly mattered beyond the glittering facade of international diplomacy. "We had a life planned," Ben said, his voice thick with memory, tinged with an aching sorrow. "When my posting was done, we were going to buy a small piece of land somewhere, away from the concrete and the crowds, grow things, live a simple life, the kind of life where you can see the results of your work at the end of the day, where the value is measured in sunshine and growth, not market indices." He fell silent for a long moment, the unspoken pain filling the space between them. There was a car accident outside of Nanjing, a drunk driver. She was gone in an instant. Everything we had planned, everything we dreamed of, evaporated in a single brutal moment. The grief, though years old, was still a palpable presence in the room, a raw, fresh wound. "After that," Ben continued, his voice barely audible, "the deals, the negotiations, the endless flights, the empty luxury of five-star hotels. It all felt so utterly meaningless. The sound of my own voice arguing over trade clauses felt like an obscenity, a cruel mockery of what I had lost. All those words, all that power, and I couldn't say the only ones that mattered. I couldn't bring her back. I couldn't fix the only thing that truly broke." He had resigned a week after the funeral without a backward glance. He cashed out his savings, put his tailored suits in storage, symbols of a life he no longer wanted, and just started driving. He drove until the cities and the suburbs turned into endless farmland, until the incessant noise of the world was replaced by the rustle of the wind through cornfields, the quiet hum of the earth. He saw a help-wanted sign on the dusty gate of Hayes Family Farms. He asked for the hardest job they had, the one that required the least amount of talking, the most amount of physical exertion, a penance for his past, a path to purification. They gave him a shovel and a set of overalls, and he had embraced the grueling, honest work with a fierce, silent dedication. "I needed to feel the ground under my feet again," Ben concluded, looking at his calloused hands, hands that had once signed treaties now stained with soil. "I needed to do work that was honest, tangible, real. Planting a seed, watching it grow, harvesting it, it makes sense. It's real. It's the opposite of a legal loophole in a contract, the antithesis of a political game. Here, my silence wasn't a weakness. It was a comfort, a shield against the noise of a world that had betrayed me." He had found solace in the simple, cyclical truths of the land, a painful but necessary reflective pause in the grand narrative of his life. Mr. Hayes listened to the entire, wrenching story without interruption, his own eyes clouded with empathy. When Ben finished, the old man was quiet for a long time, absorbing the depth of the man's suffering, the weight of his past. He looked out the same window, at the land his own family had worked for 3 generations, the very soil that embodied their legacy. He understood. He understood the lure of the soil, its power to heal, to ground a person when their world had spun off its axis, its quiet strength to absorb grief and transform it into growth. Finally, he turned back to Ben, his eyes clear and resolute, a new authority in his bearing. What Sterling did today was inexcusable. His arrogance almost cost us everything, nearly destroyed 100 years of family history. His incompetence is a liability I can no longer afford to carry, a cancer on the heart of this farm. He stood up, his posture firm, decisive. As of this moment, he is no longer employed by this farm. His contract is terminated, effective immediately. The words were simple, decisive, and final, cutting through the silence like a sharpened scythe. It wasn't an act of anger, but of necessity, born of the land itself. A farmer knows when a plant is diseased, when a crop is rotten. You don't try to reason with it, to cajole it into health. You pull it out by the roots before it can poison the rest of the crop, before it can jeopardize the entire harvest. The justice was swift, clean, and absolute, a natural consequence. Mr. Hayes walked over to the whiteboard, where the elegant, bilingual script of Ben's solution was still visible, a testament to his quiet brilliance. He ran a hand over the smooth surface, tracing the characters he couldn't read but whose meaning, whose profound significance, he now understood completely. The firing of Sterling wasn't just about punishing incompetence. It was about making space for true competence, for integrity, for the wisdom that had saved their future. It was a clearing of the soil for new, healthier growth. He found Sterling in his office, frantically stuffing papers into a briefcase, his movements agitated and uncoordinated. He didn't seem to be packing for any logical reason, more like a nervous animal building a nest out of the debris of his career, a futile attempt to impose order on his rapidly disintegrating world. He looked up as Mr. Hayes entered, a flicker of hope, desperate and pathetic in his eyes, perhaps thinking he was there to offer some sort of reprieve, a last-minute rescue. That hope died instantly when he saw the old farmer's face, etched with a cold, unwavering resolve. "Sterling," Mr. Hayes said, his voice leaving no room for argument, no space for negotiation. "Clear out your desk. I want you off my property in 30 minutes. Security will escort you." "Mr. Hayes, please," Sterling began, his voice a desperate whine cracking under the immense pressure. "It was a mistake, a simple oversight. The translator didn't show up. I was under immense pressure. I can fix this. I can still contribute." "The translator wasn't the problem," Hayes cut him off, his voice like cold steel, unwavering. "You were the problem. Your arrogance was the problem. For months, I've listened to you talk down to my people. The men and women who break their backs every day to make this place run, to cultivate this land, to build this legacy. You call them hicks, farm boys, trash. You seem to believe the logo on your business card, the price of your suit, makes you better than them, makes you infallible." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Sterling's desk, an ominous shroud. "Today, one of those farm boys, a man you humiliated this morning, a man whose quiet dignity you couldn't possibly fathom, did your job. He didn't just do it. He showed you what your job is supposed to look like when it's done by someone with intelligence, with skill, with integrity, and with profound respect for both the land and the people involved. He saved this farm from the mess you created, Sterling. He saved everything my family has worked for." Sterling slumped in his chair, all the fight gone out of him, his shoulders hunched in utter defeat. There was nothing he could say, no argument to offer. He had been so thoroughly and completely outclassed, so utterly exposed that any protest would be laughable, a final, pathetic act of self-delusion. "But the deal is signed," he managed to say, a last, pathetic attempt to claim some credit, to salvage a sliver of his shattered pride. "The company will make millions." "The company will," Hayes agreed, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will not. Security will escort you to the gate. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you." He paused at the door, a final, symmetrical blow. And that's after the $15,000 you owe Ben has been deducted. Consider it the cost of a harsh, but necessary lesson. With that, he closed the door, leaving Sterling alone in the ruins of his office, surrounded by the debris of his shattered career. The justice was swift, clean, and absolute. It was the justice of the land itself. What is rotten must be removed, must be purged, to allow new, healthy growth to flourish. The old order, the superficial hierarchy Sterling embodied, had been overturned. Mr. Hayes walked back to the conference room, where Ben was quietly erasing the whiteboard, wiping away the last evidence of the afternoon's battle, preparing to retreat back into his quiet world, to pick up his broom and resume his life of silent, solitary work. He was ready to let the past once again become nothing more than a ghost. "Leave that," Mr. Hayes said gently, his voice soft, almost paternal. Ben stopped, turning to face him, a question in his eyes. "I have a proposition for you, Ben," the old farmer said, his tone serious, thoughtful. "Sterling's position is now vacant, Director of Exports, International Liaison, whatever you want to call it. The job is yours if you want it. And not just the job, but the opportunity to rebuild this farm into something truly great, something sustainable for the next 100 years. Ben looked from Mr. Hayes to the whiteboard, then out the window to the sprawling, fertile fields that had been his refuge. The offer was a lifeline back to a world he had rejected, a world of suits and conference rooms, of endless negotiations and political machinations. It was everything he had run away from, everything that had shattered his soul. A tremor of anxiety, a ghost of his past trauma, ran through him. He shook his head slowly, a quiet refusal. "Mr. Hayes, I appreciate that more than you know, truly, but I can't. I came here to get away from that life, to find peace in honest labor. I'm a farmhand. That's all I want to be. I've found a certain solace in this anonymity, in the rhythm of the soil." Mr. Hayes nodded, as if expecting this answer, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I understand," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to go back to being that asterisk man, Ben, the one who lived on airplanes and in sterile hotels, the man consumed by an endless, meaningless chase. I'm not offering you Sterling's life. I'm offering you a new role, one we create together, one that honors both who you were and who you have become." It was the turning point, the innovation that would define Ben's new path. He walked over to stand next to Ben at the window. They both looked out at the vast expanse of the land, the fields stretching out, green and promising under the fading light. "Look out there, son. The world is changing. Family farms like this, we can't just compete with the guy in the next county anymore. We're competing with South America, with Australia, with all of Europe, with the entire global market. Our market is global. To survive, to truly thrive, we need to be smarter. We need people who understand that vast, interconnected world, but who also understand this one, the heartbeat of the land, the dignity of honest labor." He turned to Ben, his eyes earnest, filled with a vision. "I don't want you in an office in the city, disconnected from the earth. I want you here. I want you to keep your hands in the dirt, to keep fixing the tractors, to keep mending the fences, to walk these fields every morning. But I also want you to spend a few hours a day building relationships, negotiating deals, being our bridge to the rest of the world. We'll build you an office in the old barn, overlooking the west pasture, where you can see the land you're fighting for. You can wear your overalls to a video conference with Tokyo. You can negotiate a multi-million-dollar trade deal from the seat of a combine harvester if you want. It's a hybrid, Ben, a new way." It was an unconventional offer, a hybrid role that didn't exist on any corporate chart, a position built for the man, not the other way around. It was a chance to use his unique, world-class skills, but on his own terms, in a way that integrated his past with his present, rather than being consumed by it. It was a path to healing, a symmetrical fulfillment of Sarah's dream, a way to use his formidable intellect to protect the very values she held dear. Ben considered it. The thought of re-engaging with that world, with the complex pressures of international commerce, still sent a tremor of anxiety through him, a whisper of old pain. But the thought of doing it from from the place that had healed him from the heart of the land, felt different. It felt possible. He could be a guardian for this farm, protecting it with the skills that had once served faceless corporations and distant governments. He could use his voice again, not for power or prestige, but to protect this quiet life for himself, for Mr. Hayes, and for every man and woman who worked this soil. He could honor Sarah's legacy, building a different kind of value. The crisis of his purpose, of reconciling his past with his present, was quietly resolving. "You don't need a director," Ben said finally, his gaze finding Mr. Hayes's. "You need a gatekeeper, someone who understands both sides of the fence, who can speak the language of the soil and the language of the world." A slow, wide grin spread across Mr. Hayes's face. "Exactly, Ben, exactly what I need. So what do you say, gatekeeper? Do you take the post?" Ben looked out at the fields one last time, at the rich, dark soil that had saved him, that had offered him solace and purpose. He could do this. He could honor Sarah's dream and his own past at the same time, weaving them into a new, powerful narrative. "I accept," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "On my terms. My office is in the barn, and my boots will remain on the ground." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Mr. Hayes replied, clapping him on the shoulder, a bond forged in shared crisis and renewed hope. The quantifiable escalation had begun. Over the next few months, Hayes family farms underwent a quiet, yet profound transformation. Ben, in his dual role as farmhand and international liaison, became the beating heart of their global expansion. His office in the renovated barn, with its panoramic views of the West Pasture, became a hub of activity. He spent his mornings still mending fences, repairing machinery, his hands still calloused and dirty, his mind observing the nuances of crop cycles and soil health. But his afternoons were spent meticulously cultivating a global network, his satellite phone a constant companion, his reputation as a tough but fair negotiator, a man of unwavering integrity who understood both the granular details of farming and the labyrinthine complexities of international trade, grew with each new contract. Profits were up 30%, not just from the Chinese deal, but from new markets Ben had opened in Europe and South Asia, diversifying their risk and expanding their reach. Every worker on the farm, from the field hands to the packing staff, had received a substantial bonus, a tangible reward for their collective effort, a reflection of Ben's belief in shared prosperity. The family legacy was not just saved, it was flourishing, propelled by innovation and an unexpected wisdom. Yet, Ben knew the external successes were merely a reflection of an internal peace. The ghost of Sarah still lingered, but now it was a gentle presence, an inspiration, not a torment. He was using his skills not to chase power, but to protect a tangible, meaningful way of life, something she would have understood and championed. He found profound satisfaction in translating the rhythm of the seasons into strategic market moves, ensuring the bounty of their fields reached tables across the globe, enriching both the farm and its community. The struggle for meaning had found its resolution in the fertile soil. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the sweet, earthy smell of the season's final harvest hung heavy in the air, Ben stood on a loading dock, a clipboard in his hand. He was overseeing the last containers of premium soybeans being loaded onto a truck bound for the port of Oakland. And from there, across the Pacific to Shanghai. The precision of the operation, the efficiency of the logistics, was a testament to the systems he had painstakingly put in place. His usual worn denim and work boots were his uniform, but a high-tech satellite phone was clipped to his belt, a subtle symbol of his unique position, a gift from Mr. Hayes, a tool of his new trade. A commotion at the security gate caught his attention, a shrill, panicked voice cutting through the peaceful hum of the farm. A logistics manager from a competing freight company was arguing with the foreman, his voice rising in desperation. There was a problem with the customs paperwork. A last-minute sanitary and phytosanitary SPS protocol change that had been fast-tracked by the Chinese authorities just last week. It threatened to hold up the entire shipment, potentially costing thousands in late fees and jeopardizing the relationship with an overseas buyer. Ben walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel, a familiar sense of calm authority settling over him. The logistics manager was a man whose face was puffy and whose suit was rumpled, clearly haggard, worn down by a job he was demonstrably not suited for. He looked frantic, on the verge of tears, his carefully constructed career teetering on the edge of collapse. It took Ben a moment to place him, to reconcile the desperate, struggling figure with the arrogant executive of months past. But then, the recognition hit him with the force of a cold wind. It was Sterling. Sterling didn't recognize Ben at first. He just saw another farmhand, another minor cog in the rustic machinery, and dismissed him, turning his panicked attention back to the foreman. "Don't you understand? This entire shipment needs to be recertified. It's a new SPS protocol from Beijing. It could take weeks. We'll miss the shipping window, we'll incur massive penalties, it'll ruin us." Ben looked at the manifest on the foreman's clipboard. He saw the issue immediately. The exact SPS protocol Sterling was referring to. He had already adjusted all of Hayes Family Farm's paperwork to comply weeks ago, anticipating the change through his extensive network of contacts and early warning systems. He knew other companies, less prepared, less connected, would be caught completely flat-footed. Without a word, Ben unclipped his satellite phone. He dialed a number from memory, a contact etched not just in his phone, but in the deeper registers of mutual respect and shared history. After a few rings, he began speaking in low, fluent Mandarin. He wasn't speaking to an operator or a clerk. He was speaking to Deputy Director Chen of Customs at the port of Shanghai, a man he had spent years building a relationship with over countless dinners, tense negotiations, and shared moments of diplomatic crisis. He explained the situation calmly, concisely, referencing the specific protocol number, and suggesting a provisional clearance for Sterling's shipment, based on his personal guarantee that the correct digital paperwork would be filed within the hour. He invoked the unspoken bond of past favors, of shared trust. There was a brief exchange, a familiar laugh from the other end of the line, and then a firm agreement. The problem was solved. Ben hung up. He looked at the foreman, then at Sterling, whose panicked eyes were now fixed on him, a dawning horror creeping into his expression. "It's cleared," Ben said, his voice quiet, devoid of any fanfare. "They'll accept a provisional waiver. Let them load the truck. But tell them to make sure their updated paperwork is filed digitally within the hour. Director Chen is doing them a favor." The foreman nodded, relaying the order to the security guard and the bewildered truck driver. The logistics of the competing company began to move again, the wheels of commerce turning, saved from imminent disaster. The crisis was averted effortlessly, efficiently, by the man Sterling had once mocked. It was only then that Sterling finally looked at Ben, truly looked at him, and the recognition dawned, slow and agonizing. His face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a deep, soul-crushing shame. Here was the man who had taken his job, his prestige, and his salary. And that same man, the trash, the farm boy, had just effortlessly solved a problem that would have ruined Sterling's entire quarter with a single, quiet phone call to a man of genuine influence. The symmetrical catharsis was complete, utterly devastating to Sterling, utterly vindicating for Ben. There was no gloating in Ben's eyes, no triumph. There was nothing at all, merely a profound, ancient calm. He just gave Sterling a slight, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of nod you give a stranger you pass on the street, acknowledging a shared, if unequal, existence. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the fields, back toward the rhythm of the land that had saved him, leaving Sterling standing alone on the loading dock. A small, insignificant man, adrift and irrelevant in the long, prosperous shadow of the harvest. Ben didn't need to say a word. His quiet competence was a louder statement than any insult could ever be. He had found his voice, not in shouting, not in the relentless pursuit of abstract power, but in the profound, undeniable power of his own worth, anchored in purpose and integrity. The lesson was simple, written on the land itself. Respect the work, respect the worker, and understand the true value buried beneath the soil. And so, their destiny was forged, a new legacy built from the ashes of the old. The quiet gatekeeper, once broken by loss, now stood as a master of systems, a bridge between soil and global commerce, his wisdom rooted in the earth, his reach extending across oceans. His story now belongs to time, a testament to resilience, but its power only grows if shared. The greatest strength is often found not in the loudest pronouncements, but in the quietest souls, and true value is measured not by the suit you wear, but by the ground you stand on and the respect you earn. But as one man breaks the system that judged him, empowering himself through humility and competence, another remains trapped by a system he cannot see, forever chasing fleeting symbols of power. What happens when the walls we build to protect ourselves become our prisons? And what new frontiers await the silent master, now poised to shape the very world he once fled? The journey has only just begun.